Hi, guys. Clicking the wrong thing. All right, so we are going to start off with a reading about the presidency of John Adams, and then I'm going to lecture, and you're going to take notes, given the slotted notes that I gave you in class. When George Washington was elected president for both terms, the Electoral College unanimously voted for him. This was not the case for the second president of the United States. While Washington had set an example for a peaceful transfer of power, the election of 1796 became a bitter fight between John Adams, a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. The Federalists viewed themselves as an organized government, and they viewed the Democratic Republicans as dangerous radicals who would bring chaos, like the French Revolution. To the U.S. Democratic Republicans, they viewed themselves as supporters of independence and fighting for equal rights. And they viewed the Federalists as wanting to create a type of monarchy in the U.S. that would only benefit the wealthy. So Adams becomes the second president with a 71-68 win over Jefferson in 1796. According to the Constitution, the candidate with the second highest number of votes in the Electoral College would be vice president. However, when the Constitution was written, the political parties didn't exist. The new president and vice president were from opposing political parties, with vastly different beliefs on the government policies. This would cause dangerous problems during Adams' term. Also, because the margin of victory was so small, it was apparent how divided the country had become. Sectionalism was developing in the young country despite George Washington's earlier warning. The Northern voters supporting Adams and the Federalist Party, the Southern voters supporting Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans Party. Adams was an ideal candidate for president. He was an experienced politician, had served on the Continental Congress and the Committee of Five that drafted the Declaration of Independence. He also traveled to Europe during the American Revolution to gain support for the Patriot cause. He was one of the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris that ended the war, and he continued his international duties by making trade between the U.S. and European countries. Adams then served as vice president for Washington. Despite all his qualifications, Adams served only one term. He faced many problems, such as the ongoing international conflict with Great Britain and France, and passing the questionable Alien and Sedition Acts. He also received extreme criticism from Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Like Washington, Adams had to negotiate with the British and French because the French Revolution was still happening. When the U.S. had signed Jay's Treaty with Great Britain in 1794, France became angry. By the end of 1796, France had ended its relationship with the U.S. Over the next 2 years, France seized more than 300 American ships. Adams sent diplomats to France to negotiate peace, but France would not agree to stop attacking American ships. In 1798, the Department of the Navy was established. Between 1798 and 1800, the U.S. fought naval battles with France, even though a formal declaration of war had not been made. The U.S. was fighting its former ally and became an unofficial ally of Great Britain, a country the U.S. had been at war with 15 years earlier. Adams adopted anti-French policies that were supported by the most Federalists. The anti-French view spread across the U.S., including those Americans who had supported the French cause. Many French refugees had left their home country to escape the war and settled in the U.S. However, there was a strong anti-French mood in the U.S. Many Federalists were also concerned the refugees would support the Democratic Republicans because the party supported the French cause. In response, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in June of 1798. The Federalists wanted to retain power in Congress, so they limited the voting rights of immigrants. Before the new legislation was passed, an immigrant had to live in the U.S. for 5 years before he could apply to vote. Remember, just men at this point. Now he would have to live in the U.S. for 14 years. Most of the immigrants were French, British, and Irish. Because most of them supported the Democratic Republican Party, Jefferson accused Adams of trying to prevent the Democratic Republican Party from gaining power. Another part of this legislation gave the executive branch the power to deport any immigrant determined to be dangerous to the U.S. or who had ties to a country that was at war with the U.S. The last part of the Alien and Sedition Acts made it illegal to publicly disagree with the U.S. government. Someone who wrote, spoke, or published anything false, scandalous, or malicious about the government or government officials could be fined or even imprisoned. Adams was given the power to decide if someone committed treason against the U.S. government. Democratic Republicans and their supporters were targeted because they printed their own newspapers and pamphlets that opposed the Federalist-controlled government. As a result, over 20 Democratic Republican newspaper editors were imprisoned. Jefferson and Madison urged the state governments to refuse to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts because they violated the First Amendment, which was freedom of speech and of the press. Virginia and Kentucky believed that states had the right to determine whether federal laws were unconstitutional. Today, the judicial branch decides if the federal law is unconstitutional before it's passed, but this was not the policy back then. Therefore, in 1798, Virginia and Kentucky passed legislation that declared the Alien and Sedition Acts unlawful. This began the idea of nullification, which means states have the right to refuse to follow federal law if they found it unconstitutional and against states' rights. By 1800, Adams had little support from the government and from Americans. Fighting with France had stopped with the Treaty of Convention in 1800, and the French Revolution was over. However, most of the Federalists in Congress were angry with Adams because they wanted war with France and not a treaty. Many Americans were angry with Adams because the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional. As a result, Adams lost his re-election, ending a one-year term that was full of conflict, and he becomes our first. Ending a one-term president that was full of conflict. He is our first and one of only a few one-term presidents. Okay. So we are going to move on now to the notes, and you are going to be taking notes as I present this guy. All right, the election of 1796. So this is just a little bit of a review of the notes that you just that we just read. So as I'm reading, it should be John Adams. All right, bear with me in real time. John Adams. Okay. So John Adams is a Federalist. Obviously, he is up against Thomas Jefferson, who is a Democratic Republican. The Federalists viewed themselves as an organized government because they had been the government that was in power under George Washington. They also viewed the Democratic Republicans as dangerous radicals that would bring chaos to the U.S. And their point was, as we just read, you don't have any political experience, so you've not shown that you can run a government. Therefore, you are dangerous radicals. But the Federalists have proven that. Again, we had George Washington. He was a Federalist. Look how well he did. So therefore, we know how to run a government. The Democratic Republicans viewed themselves as supporters of independence and fighters for equal rights. When we say equal rights, we're not talking about freeing slaves. We're not talking about giving women equal rights. We're talking about keeping the rights, really, that the average American had. The Democratic Republicans viewed Federalists as wanting to create a type of monarchy in the U.S. that would benefit the wealthy. Okay, so Adams wins with 71 Electoral College votes. Jefferson loses with 68 Electoral College votes. Pretty close. Adams becomes the president. Jefferson becomes the vice president. As per the Constitution at this time, major problem, though, as we've talked about, you now have two political parties. Again, when the Constitution was written, we didn't have political parties. George Washington was very against the idea of a political party because he said it sowed division. It created division in America when we had these two political parties. He did not want that. Yet, flash forward 8 years, here we are, two political parties, and based on the way our Constitution was written, we have a president from one and a vice president from the other. There were really close margins of victory, so the country became even more divided despite Washington's warnings. The North went towards Adams and the Federalists. The South went towards Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Again, starting this road to the Civil War, you're going to see a lot of North versus South, North versus South. The North does this, the South does that. We're on our way. Okay. So Adams served on the Continental Congress and the Committee of Five who wrote the Constitution. So he is very experienced. He had traveled to Europe during the American Revolution to gain support for the Patriot cause. He had signed the Treaty of Paris. He helped negotiate international trade deals, and he had already served under George Washington. So here's this idea again that the Federalists understand how to govern. He would put out the message that he understood how to govern the American people because he has been doing it for so long. All right, in comes France. So France was angry that we signed the Jay Treaty with Great Britain in 1794 because that directly affected France and our trade with France more specifically. Remember, the Jay Treaty was that Great Britain would stop stealing our soldiers and forcing our sailors and forcing them into indentured servitude, essentially. And John Jay was not that successful, right? He went over with 4 points. He came back with only 2. But it really hurt trade with France. And France is angry because it looks like we're kind of being traitors. And also, we refused to help support the French Revolution in the same way that the French had helped support us in the American Revolution. So France is just mad. They're just mad with us. They're just not happy. So by the end of 1796, France officially ends its relationship with the United States. And they do this by beginning to attack our Navy. So over the next 2 years, France seizes more than 300 American ships. In 1798, the U.S. Department of the Navy was officially established because we had to protect ourselves. We recognized that we needed not just an army, we also needed a sea power. And then in 1798 to 1800, we fought naval battles with France. We do not declare a formal war. This is just, kind of, I'm showing you my power, you're showing me your power, and it's all happening again in the Navy. The U.S. has become the unofficial ally of Great Britain at this point, and Adams goes further by adopting anti-French policies that were supported by most Federalists. So we start to see this anti-French attitude popping up. But we have a ton of French refugees who left France when they went through their French Revolution. And so they had come to America and they were making lives for themselves as immigrants in a country that had once been very friendly to them. But there's this strong anti-French mood that spreads across the U.S. And you're going to see this throughout American history. This very much looks like right around the time of World War I, when the government uses the Sedition Acts again, when we have a very high anti-Austrian and anti-German sentiment because of what was happening during World War I. So this is something that will continue on in American history. The Federalists were concerned that refugees would support the Democratic Republicans because the Democratic Republicans supported the French. So if you have one political party that supports French interest, the thought was that the immigrants who now considered themselves American but had French background or roots would support the Democratic Republicans, and that was concerning to the Federalists. So what do? Okay, they passed 2 incredibly unpopular laws. The first one was the Alien Act, and then the second one was the Sedition Act. So let's talk about the Alien Act first. They were both passed in 1798. The Federalists wanted to retain power in Congress. And this was really what drove these two acts. First thing that the Alien Act says is it limits voting rights for immigrants. Immigrants had to live in the U.S. for 14 years to be able to vote. That's a long time. Before it had been 5. Jefferson accused Adams of trying to prevent the Democratic-Republican Party from gaining power because most of those immigrants would have supported the Democratic Republicans. Also gave the executive branch the power to deport, meaning take out of America and send back to their home country any immigrant determined to be dangerous to the U.S. or who had ties to a country that was at war with the U.S. So let's think how this could have affected our future history. So we see, let's say we have we're fighting Italy in World War II. Okay, so the government could come in and remove everybody who has any sort of Italian heritage and send them back to Italy. Oftentimes, these people in America at this point had been living here for so long that they weren't really French. They considered themselves American. So to deport someone who had fully made a life and had ties with America was very, cruel. Okay. So it also made it illegal to publicly disagree with the U.S. government. Someone who wrote, spoke, or published anything false or scandalous or malicious against the government could be fined or imprisoned. Adams was given the power to decide if someone had committed treason against the U.S. government. This gave him a lot of power. The Democratic Republicans and their supporters were targeted because they printed newspapers and pamphlets that opposed the Federalists in Congress. So this gave Adams the power to really attack the Democratic Republican Party. Over 20 Democratic Republican newspaper editors were imprisoned. When you start to silence the news like that, you begin to violate the First Amendment. And so that was what the argument was the news that was getting published at the time was only one-sided. Well, is that really fair? Is that fair and balanced? Is that a violation of the First Amendment? Okay. Jefferson and Madison urged states' governments to refuse to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts. They claimed it violated the First Amendment right to freedom of speech and to the press. And so that's when Virginia and Kentucky step in, and they say that the states had the right to determine whether federal laws were unconstitutional. Now the Supreme Court does that, but back then we didn't have the judiciary set up, so the states did it. And in 1798, Virginia and Kentucky passed legislation that declares the Alien and Sedition Acts unlawful. Once that happens, all the states begin to be able to nullify or, make null, take away the federal laws. So here's the first page of the letter written by James Madison to Thomas Jefferson in 1798. And this called the Alien and Sedition Acts a monster that must forever disgrace its parents. Okay, so because of this, John Adams had little support by 1800. And he was the fighting with France had ended, but the Federalists in Congress had wanted a war, and they were angry with Adams that he had not declared war. The Democratic Republicans are angry with Adams for the Alien and Sedition Acts and just in general because they're the opposing party. And so he loses. He becomes our first one-term president. And he's one of a very few. There's only a small handful, but he was the first one-term president. And obviously Jefferson wins the election of 1800, which we will talk about next. Okay? All right. Let's get out of this guy.